Welcome to this guide on navigating matchups and sideboarding in Pioneer. This video will go over the best decks in the format, the favorability of matchups among them, and how to navigate and sideboard in those matchups. I've already made primers for each deck covered in this video, which you can watch to learn more about how they function. Links to those primers and sample deck lists are in the description. You can also jump to specific chapters in the video if you're only interested in specific decks or matchups. The best decks. So, which decks are considered to be the best isn't set in stone, but in general, they're the decks that are the most popular and have the most positive data-driven results. Data is the best criterion to look at first, such as regularly appearing in the 5-0 bracket of Moto leagues and top finishes in online challenges and paper tournaments. Power, speed, consistency, resilience, and a good matchup spread are attributes of the top performing decks. So with all that in mind, I'm going to go over what I believe are currently the 12 best decks in the format. This isn't to say that you can't win with another deck, but these are the ones with the best data-driven results and are the ones you should expect to see most often at tournaments. The best decks are, in rough order of popularity, Rakdos Midrange, Nykthos Ramp, Abzan Greasefang, Mono White Humans, CoCo decks, e.g. Bant Spirits, 2-4 color humans, Blue White Control, Izzet Phoenix, 4-5 color midrange piles such as Fires and Nykthos, Rakdos Sacrifice, Lotus Field, Mono Red Aggro, and Mono Blue Spirits. Note, the decks shown are samples from recently high-performing lists and don't necessarily represent the only way or only optimal way to build them. Regarding sideboarding, I'll go over the most common cards found in these decks, but there are always variations and sometimes players sideboard in unexpected ways or play unexpected cards. For example, Nykthos Ramp can splash into other colors and there are a myriad of wishboard targets for Karn. Rakdos Sacrifice can be built as Jund Sacrifice and may include Korvold, Trail of Crumbs, or Gilded Goose. Mono Red Aggro can be built as a low-to-the-ground red aggro deck that relies on burn spells, or a bigger, mid-rangier aggro deck that has big burst damage spells like Embercleave and Torbran. To briefly sum up the individual decks, Rakdos Midrange is widely considered to be among the best decks in the format, if not the best. It's to Pioneer as Jund is to Modern, a solid mid-range deck with value-generating cards, no obvious weaknesses, and the tools to fight anything. Nykthos Ramp is the runner-up as the second most popular deck in the format, a big mono ramp into combo deck that works like a merger between Modern Amulet Titan and Storm. Nykthos' biggest weakness is a mediocre early game, little interaction, and severely limited sideboard due to Karn. Next is a 50% drop-off in popularity to Abzan Greasefang, a mid-range combo deck that mostly banks on the synergy between Greasefang and Parhelion for quick and easy wins, but which also has a decent mid-range plan if that fails. Following closely behind is Mono White Humans, likely the best aggro deck in the format, having a suite of tools to fight against different strategies, including various hate creatures, and being able to push through stalled boards via Brave the Elements. Those four decks combined make up a little more than 50% of the format, with all of the other remaining decks concentrated in the remaining 50%. CoCo decks are base green-white or white-blue splashing green, and are creature decks built on the power of Collected Company. They consist of decks like Bant Spirits and 2-4 color humans. The main differences between them are how heavily they focus on aggression versus disruption. Think Mantis Rider versus Archon of Emeria or Adeline versus Reflector Mage, but all of them are essentially aggressive creature decks with a mid-game CoCo value plan. Blue White Control is the format's top control deck and functions exactly as you'd expect, just like Blue White Control always does. It's a mix of counterspells, removal, and sweepers designed to delay the game until you can land finishers like Teferi or the Wandering Emperor and overtake the opponent with superior card advantage. Izzet Phoenix is a tempo control deck that sets up the early game with cheap cantrips and removal before suddenly exploding in a single turn by returning multiple Phoenixes, flipping Thing in the Ice, or chaining extra turn spells via Temporal Trespass and Galvanic Iteration. Below Phoenix are the 4-5 color mid-range piles. These are decks like Fires of Invention and Nykthos. While the specific cards differ significantly, the basic plans are roughly the same. Spend the early turns setting up and disrupting the opponent with removal, then eventually take over the mid to late game with overwhelming value via card advantage, greater mana, and/or a superior board presence. Next are Rakdos and Jund Sacrifice. These are attrition-based decks looking to abuse small, cheap creatures and effects that sacrifice them for value, mainly Mayhem Devil. The main difference between the green and non-green versions are that straight Rakdos is more aggressive, whereas Jund incorporates more of a mid-rangey card advantage plan with things like Trail of Crumbs and Korvold, although some versions splash green only for Korvold. Lotus Field is the format's top stack-based combo deck, if you don't count Nykthos, having almost no interaction but looking to consistently win by turn 4. Mono Red Aggro is, like Blue White Control, basically the same as it always is. Play cheap creatures and go, possibly finishing up with burn spells. Differences in builds mainly come down to how many burn spells versus creatures are played, with more aggressive builds playing many cheap creatures and burn spells, and more mid-rangey builds playing fewer burn spells and bigger threats like Embercleave, Torbrand, or Hazaret. Finally, Mono Blue Spirits is the remaining aggro deck, differentiating itself from others in its archetype with evasive creatures, counterspells, and Curious Obsession. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the matchups. Rakdos Midrange vs Nykthos Ramp. This matchup is generally considered to be bad, however I think the common consensus is overstated. While Nykthos Ramp is favored, it's not by much. I'd peg it around a 45-55 matchup. The reason things initially look bad is because once Nykthos gets going, the deck can deploy multiple big threats and value generators in a single turn, and it's too much for Rakdos to keep up with. However, getting there is the issue, and Rakdos has plenty of tools to hamper their progress. Early Monodorks can be picked off by every single piece of removal in the deck, and Thoughtseize takes care of the big threats. The thing about Nykthos is that there are actually only two threats you need to worry about: Karn and Storm the Festival since it finds Karn. Even though Troll and Cavalier are big threats, the rest of the deck isn't designed to back them up, and your own threats actually line up decently against them. You want to use early Thoughtseize and removal to disrupt their development, and deploy threats to apply pressure, the best curve being turn 1 removal or Thoughtseize, followed by turn 2 Blood Tithe Harvester into a turn 3 threat such as Fable. You need to apply pressure. You can't keep hands with high interaction but no threats, or only expensive threats, since their mid to late game is better than yours. Both Troll and Cavalier benefit from death triggers, and flashing back Storm the Festival is a big part of their game plan, which is why exile-based removal and graveyard hate come in handy. Kalidas and removal like Epic Downfall are good ways to combat the creatures. Go Blank and Unlicensed Hearse can eat the graveyard, with Hearse able to snipe Troll and Cavalier when they die. Extinction Event is excellent against them since all of their creatures have odd mana values and it exiles them. Your worst cards, which can be sided out, are those that are slow and designed to accumulate incremental value, things like Kroxa and redundant copies of Kalidas or Sheoldred. Rakdos Midrange vs Abzan Greasefang. Hey, it's Greasefang! As the name suggests, the important card is Greasefang. You should kill it. Thoughtseize and Fatal Push are your main interaction cards, however Greasefang has a lot of redundancy, including Grizzly Salvage and Can't Stay Away, so it may be difficult to keep them off it. Kalidas gains more points than normal by exiling Greasefang, so they can't rebuy it. Similarly, Graveyard Trespasser can eat cards out of the graveyard, especially on the play if they're binned to sorcery speed effects like Satyr Wayfinder or Rafine's Informant. Game 1 can be rough, but you get a lot of cards after sideboarding. Rending Volley, Unlicensed Hearse, a Braid for Parhelion, anything that kills Greasefang, hits graveyards, or otherwise stops their combo comes in. Conversely, anything that doesn't do any of those should be considered expendable. Bone Crusher Giant, which doesn't kill Greasefang, Kroxa and Liliana, which can be detrimental by letting them discard vehicles, or Sheoldred, which is slow. Rakdos Midrange vs Aggro and CoCo. Mono White Humans, Mono Red Aggro, Mono Blue Spirits, and CoCo decks. All of these matchups boil down to keeping them off a substantial board state with removal spells and building superior board of your own. There's also knowing who's the beatdown, which will usually be the other deck with you playing defense, especially on the draw. The main differences to watch out for are humans having access to Brave the Elements as both a protection spell and way to attack into or through your blockers, red having more removal, reach, and blowout cards like Embercleave, spirits having counterspells and evasive creatures, and CoCo decks having CoCo of course, but also potentially flyers or value creatures depending on the version. In all cases, you want to bring in more removal and sweepers and cut slower cards which are bad on defense like Kroxa. Kalidas is particularly good in all scenarios due to its life gain and ability to convert removal spells into blockers. CoCo decks are usually, but not always, more value-oriented and can be more of a back-and-forth grind than the other aggro decks. Incidental life gain from cards like Graveyard Trespasser and Sheoldred may also be valuable, especially against red aggro that relies on burn for reach. Against red decks that heavily rely on burn, cut Thoughtseize. However, keep them in if they have more substantial threats like Embercleave. Any of these decks may bring in more interaction post-board, but things don't change much. Rakdos Midrange vs Blue-White Control. This matchup is a grindy slugfest with games coming down more to breaking value parity than any sort of tempo. Here, you're looking for cards that are built in 2-for-1s and value generators like Graveyard Trespasser, Fable the Mirror Breaker, Liliana, Kroxa, etc. It's important to navigate around counterspells and know which ones can be sidestepped, like paying 1 for Censor or casting creatures into Dovin's Veto rather than non-creatures. You can also Thoughtseize to clear the way. However, sometimes there's nothing you can do and you just have to jam your threats into counterspells. It's important not to overextend creatures into sweepers like Supreme Verdict and Farewell, and not to attack into the Wandering Emperor. However, you can't dawdle and need to apply at least some pressure since they can take over the late game with Teferi or Shark Typhoon. Threats that don't need to attack or which pose an issue for them by themselves are good, such as Sheoldred, Liliana, and Kroxa. Dreadbore is particularly important for dealing with resolved planeswalkers. Sideboarding on both sides involves taking out substandard interaction or threats for better ones or more of them. In your case, Fatal Push sucks and is the easiest cut. Rakdos Midrange vs Izzet Phoenix. The good thing about this matchup is that their threats aren't actually that bad for you for the most part. Ledger Shredder and Thing in the Ice become issues if not dealt with, but you can Fatal Push or Dreadbore either of them. Arclight Phoenix isn't that good at racing you unless they get 2 or more and quickly. However, it's a problem if they keep returning, which is where Kalidas and Graveyard Trespasser come in handy. The bigger issue is their Delve spells. Treasure Cruise pulls way ahead on cards, and Temporal Trespass gives them a significant tempo advantage, and both become brutal when multiplied by Galvanic Iteration. Thoughtseize can delay them and is especially good for hitting threats and Delve spells, but they have so many draw effects that you can't keep them off balance for long. Shieldred is your single best card against them, punishing all of their draw effects, including Ledger Shredder's trigger, which is mandatory. Their removal is all burn spells, with the ones you need to be wary of being 2 to 3 damage from Fiery Impulse and 5 from Lightning Axe. They have few if any counter spells, but still, try to avoid jamming Fable or Liliana into Spell Pierce. A lot of your sideboard is quite good against them. Duress for spells, of course, Rending Volley hits Thing and Ledger Shredder, Go Blank hits their hand and graveyard, Extinction Event since it exiles Phoenix and all their creatures have even mana values, and Unlicensed Hearse to snipe Phoenix and reduce Delve Fodder. For Hearse and other slow graveyard hate, you can never keep them off enough Delve Fodder forever, so it's better to prioritize hitting Phoenixes unless you're liable to lose to Cruise or Trespass. Cards to cut are Blood Tithe Harvester and Bone Crusher Giant. Bone Crusher is slow and doesn't hit anything except Phoenix, which just comes back anyway. Blood Tithe gets hit by their cheap burn spells and can't attack through Thing or Ledger Shredder. Rakdos Midrange versus 4 to 5 color Midrange. Being the aggressor and beating down is what's important in these matchups. Fires and Nykthos are better late game decks, better value generators, and will go over the top of you eventually, so you need to tempo them out. If you fail to beat them quickly, they can land huge, hard to beat threats like Koma, the Scarab God, Kenrith, Agent of Treachery, Tybalt, etc. However, they also have a decent amount of removal themselves to beat back your creatures. Thoughtseize is very important, taking removal that would slow you down, or their best threat or value generator. Hand Disruption is the best axis to fight them on, dealing with threats preemptively before they can accrue any value and at a cheap cost. Therefore, bring in Duress and Liliana. Fatal Push is your worst card since they don't have much you want to hit with it, in Nykthos' case actually nothing. Enigmatic Fires relies a lot on bigger creatures, so you can bring in Extinction Event. Rakdos Midrange versus Rakdos Sac. The Sac deck is primarily looking to beat you via attrition, slowly whittling away your health one ping at a time. The most important cards to worry about are Mayhem Devil and Corvold in green versions. If you can handle those two threats, you should be good, regardless of any cat or anvil loops since they're slow. Green versions are grindier and more mid-rangey. They may only have Corvold, or they may play additional card advantage engines like Trail of Crumbs. You can't fight their small creatures with traditional removal since they either come back or killing them doesn't matter, but you can and should hit Devil or Corvold. Kalidas is your single best card since it completely shuts down their sack shenanigans. After sideboarding, Hidetsugu Consumes All joins them since it obliterates Oven and their graveyard. Hearse can be used to snipe Cat in response to them trying to recur it. Cards that hit artifacts like a Braid are also useful for hitting Oven or Anvil. One powerful access they have of fighting you is stealing your creatures with Claim the Firstborn and sacking them. Bone Crusher Giant and Blood Tithe Harvester aren't so great when they can be stolen and they don't kill Devil. Keep in mind that Devil triggers for both players, meaning your blood, treasure, and reflected tokens can be a liability. Rakdos Midrange versus Lotus Field. You're 100% the beatdown in this matchup, trying to race them before they combo off. However, you can't actually kill them fast enough, which is where Hand Disruption comes in. Thoughtseize and effects like it are the most important cards in this matchup. Bring in every Duress and Go Blank you can. The most important card to hit will depend on context. You want to get rid of multiple card draw spells like Pour Over the Pages, payoffs such as Emergent Ultimatum, or hidden strings to keep them from having enough mana, so it's a matter of whatever they need most or what they're missing. Conversely, your removal spells are completely useless, so cut them. Your more aggressive creatures like Blood Tithe Harvester are better than slower, value-oriented creatures like Kalidas. Rakdos Midrange Mirror Match. The Mirror Match is a grindy slugfest that's all about value. 2-for-1s and value-generating cards are at a premium. You should expect the game to go long as both players trade creatures and removal. Therefore, your best cards are Kalidas, Kroxa, Graveyard Trespasser, especially since it hits Kroxa out of the graveyard, and Fable the Mirror Breaker. There are a lot of specific situations that you should navigate around. Save removal for the most problematic threats like Kalidas, Shieldred, and Fable if you can. Conversely, try to make your opponent waste their removal on your worst threats. Graveyard Trespasser's ward ability is great, but it gets bypassed by Liliana, so try not to play it solo. In fact, try not to play any important threat solo. Bone Crusher Giant kills Blood Tithe Harvester. Thoughtseize is bad and should be cut. The reason being that, because the game is going to go long, you'll get into top deck battles, and top decking it is awful. A general rule of thumb is to minimize bad top deck cards in grindy mid-range mirrors. Some good sideboard considerations are Hearse and Reckoner Bankbuster. Nykthos Ramp. Before getting to the matchups, a brief word on the best build and sideboard. Nykthos Ramp is unique among decks in that because so many cards in the sideboard are devoted to Karn, you have very few actual cards to sideboard in any given matchup, sometimes none at all. This means that nearly every matchup only gets worse after game 1, and this is what I consider to be Nykthos Ramp's biggest weakness. In general, the only times you sideboard in artifacts are when you desperately need them early before you'd be able to play Karn and then play them, or when they're better than bad mainboard cards but not great Karn targets. So, what's the best build of Nykthos Ramp? Currently, it's a white splash for Teferi who slows the sunset and white sideboard cards. Teferi gives you another combo via the Chain Veil that can sometimes win in situations you couldn't win in otherwise. The white sideboard cards like Portable Hole are incredibly important for dealing with aggro decks, especially since they're the only removal fetchable by Karn that are also cheap enough to realistically be played the same turn. A quick addendum to the Nykthos ramp sideboard. The majority of this guide was created before the Brothers War released, and with that set comes a number of important artifacts that will probably wind up seeing play in the sideboard. First of all, Cityscape Leveler probably replaces Meteor Golem. If artifact and enchantment based decks become popular enough, such as 4-color Enigmatic Fires, Haywire Might could easily see play in the sideboard and could be brought in against other decks that are playing things like Leyline Binding, Portable Hole, etc. The Might Stone and the Weak Stone serves a similar function to Sky Sovereign and could either replace Sky Sovereign or be played alongside it. Similarly, Urza's Silex is close to Karn's Silex in terms of what it does and could see play in the sideboard. And lastly, the Stone Brain provides a cranial extraction effect for Nykthos ramp, which it didn't have previously. This could either see play alongside Damping Sphere or replace it entirely, and is most notably good against Lotus Field and in the Mirror. With the Stone Brain, the most likely names are either Nykthos or Karn against the Mirror, and against Lotus Field you could name Lotus Field itself or whatever win con they have, such as Mastermind's Acquisition. Nykthos ramp versus Rakdos midrange. This matchup is generally considered to be good, however I think that consensus is overstated. While Nykthos ramp is favored, it's not by much, maybe about 55-45. The reason things initially look good is because, once Nykthos gets going, the deck can deploy multiple big threats and value generators in a single turn, and it's too much for Rakdos to keep up with. However, getting there is the issue, and Rakdos has plenty of tools to hamper your progress. Your early Monodorks are susceptible to all kinds of removal, and Thoughtseize can be very disruptive. Additionally, Rakdos will put pressure on you, and you therefore can't take too long to get underway. They also have plenty of tools to hamstring your cards, especially post-board. Kalidas, Epic Downfall, Unlicensed Hearse, Go Blank, and Extinction Event. These are all cards that can exile your permanents or graveyard, thereby bypassing the death triggers on Troll and Cavalier and stopping Storm flashbacks. You need to keep hands with ramp and accept that sometimes you'll just lose to removal or Thoughtseize. You also block poorly, meaning any planeswalkers you cast are vulnerable to being attacked. The best wish targets for Karn are usually Sky Sovereign since it kills most of their threats, or God Pharaoh statue if you landed early enough. If they have little pressure and it looks like the game is going to go long, you can grab Restorative Burst. Sometimes you'll be in danger of dying to Reflection of Kiki-Jiki next turn and only have 1 to 2 extra mana, in which case you should grab Pithing Needle or Glass Casket. Keep in mind that anything you wish to your hand but can't play immediately can potentially be discarded to Thoughtseize, Kroxa, or Liliana. Nykthos ramp versus Abzan Greasefang. This is your absolute worst matchup, especially on the draw since you often have no answer to a Greasefang Parhelion. Once you get clocked for 13 damage on turn 3 and there are 2 Angel tokens left behind, there's nothing you can draw to survive. They also have Thoughtseize to disrupt you. The only answers you have are either 1 to 2 copies of Beseiju, which only delay them since they can return Parhelion again next turn, or racing to resolve Karn as fast as possible. You need to aggressively mulligan to hands with Karn, or an obscene turn 3 to 4 sequence of mana ramp that can potentially win immediately, or deploy multiple Cavaliers to block before Parhelion comes down. Board in Tormod's Crypt and Pithing Needle since time is of the essence, and if you resolve Karn, they can't crew their vehicles anyway. You can trim slower, low-impact cards like the 4th Kiora, a 2nd Teferi, or a Troll. Don't rest on your laurels just because you have Karn or a hate piece out. Karn can still be attacked to death, and they have answers to your hate pieces such as Abrupt Decay. If you do manage to delay them, focus on either finishing the game via combo as fast as possible or set up redundant lock pieces. In Game 1, Karn should wish for Needle or Tormod's Crypt first as a backup, removal for Greasefang, e.g. Sky Sovereign or Glass Casket, or blockers to protect himself, e.g. Heart of Kirin or Essica's Chariot. Nykthos ramp versus mono-white humans. All aggro matchups are bad, but this one's the worst. Not only are they fast, they have creatures which disrupt your big plays or which exile your creatures such as Thalia, Brutal Cathar, and Redain. Hopeful Initiate can destroy Karned artifacts, and you can't rely on blockers since they'll eventually be able to swing through your board with Brave the Elements. Since their removal is exile-based, they bypass the triggers on Troll and Cavalier. Post-board, they gain access to more removal, including Declaration in Stone and Portable Hole, and may bring in Rest in Peace to shut down the Restorative Burst combo. Karn and Storm the Festival are often too slow, especially in the face of Thalia. However, you can't cut them completely since they're your main engine and you need Storm to make Cavalier good. Generally, I'd be okay with cutting around 3 to 4 cards, trimming 1 copy of Oath, Cavalier, Teferi, Kiora, or Storm, and 2 copies of Karn. Bring in removal such as Portable Hole and Tulsimir. Sky Sovereign is actually better off main deck since Karning for it is too slow. Always leave at least 1 piece of removal in the sideboard for Karn, e.g. Glass Casket. Karn's Silex gives the deck a sweeper, although 7 mana for Karn plus Silex is quite slow. It requires 2 to 3 additional mana on top of that to activate, and it enters tapped, although you can override that with Kiora or Teferi. Silex is liable to get hit by Hopeful Initiate and can also be sidestepped by Dauntless Bodyguard. Generally, you want a Karn either for Portable Hole to immediately remove a threat or Sky Sovereign if you have time. If you're in danger of being one-shotted by Brave the Elements, Karn for Heart of Kirin so you have a blocker, or Restorative Burst to get out of range. Nykthos ramp versus CoCo decks. The matchup depends on exactly what CoCo deck it is, be it Bant Spirits, Green-White Company, 4-color Humans, etc. Generally, the CoCo decks are going to break down into either aggressive or disruptive builds. Regardless, these are all white aggro decks and therefore bad matchups. Mausoleum Wanderer, Redain, Archon of Emeria, either Thalia, these are all cards that can stifle your development. Archon and similar Rule of Law effects in particular are really bad for you. Blue Company decks can run counterspells such as Spell Queller, Lofty Denial, etc. Side the same way as against mono white humans, bring in Portable Hole, Tulsimir, Sky Sovereign, and trim on slower cards that get hit by taxing effects. Always keep in mind what answers your opponent could have. Play out more mana sources to pay for Lofty Denial or Mausoleum Wanderer. Don't cast removal against a potential Rattle Chains unless you have to. Don't expect Cavalier to be enough of a roadblock since they can go wide and Spirits tap it with Shacklegeist. Nykthos Ramp versus Blue-White Control. Blue-White Control is fairly even matchup-wise. The main way they beat you is by countering your threats early and landing to Fairy, then pulling ahead on cards while continuing to answer whatever threat you play. They have plenty of answers and cheap ones to boot, so you'll never be able to race them. Your main plan should be to try and overpower them with superior mana and win via attrition, not the combo. Use Karn to grab value cards like Restorative Burst and Eseka's Chariot. While you can get God Pharaoh Statue or Pithing Needle to shut down Planeswalkers, keep in mind that they have plenty of all-purpose exile-based answers including March of Otherworldly Light, Detention Sphere, Portable Hole, and Farewell. Statue can slow them down, but you're only buying time. The only upside to their removal exiling is that you can retrieve artifacts with Karn. Never turn God Pharaoh's Statue into a creature with Karn unless you absolutely need to race them, since doing so opens it up to creature removal like Supreme Verdict, Fateful Absence, and the Wandering Emperor. Similarly, be extremely cautious about attacking with Troll or Cavalier since the Wandering Emperor can exile them. Keep in mind that the counterspells they play include Censor and Dovin's Veto, meaning it's safer to play creatures over non-creatures, and it's safer to play a cheaper but worse spell if you can hold mana up to pay for it. However, sometimes you can't avoid counterspells, especially the 3-mana hard counters, and you'll just have to jam your threats into them until they run out. Farewell is their best card against you since it deals with your graveyard and therefore Storm the Festival, and all your threats except Planeswalkers, including random Wolfwillow Havens and Oaths, setting you way back on board and Devotion. Post-board, they'll bring in more counterspells and other answers, whereas you have nothing for them. Rest in Peace has to be dealt with since it shuts off all your death triggers, storms, and you can't combo through it with Restorative Burst. Nykthos Ramp versus Izzet Phoenix. The Phoenix matchup is actually somewhat simple and comes down to just a few key points. Their main plan is to flip Thing in the Ice, and your plan is to kill them before they do. Thing in the Ice bounces your board, depriving you of blockers and Devotion, and is usually game over if they can back it up with Temporal Trespass. You can even lose from an empty board if they have enough mana to go Thing, Spells, Trespass. If you can't win before Thing flips, grab Portable Hole to exile it. Outside of going mana crazy, your best line is to jam Karn out ASAP and grab God Pharaoh's Statue since it severely restricts what they can do, including casting 3 spells for Phoenix. Statue isn't foolproof though since they have Otawara and Sideboard of Raid. You can additionally tutor up Damping Sphere as backup, but keep in mind that it also shuts off Nykthos. Otherwise, you can grab Tormod's Crypt or another graveyard hate card like Unlicensed Hearse. However, between various cheap spells and pieces of the puzzle, you'll never be able to keep them off enough fodder for their Delve spells. With Tormod's Crypt, you'll have to make the context-sensitive decision on whether to pop it immediately and delay Treasure Cruise or wait to snipe Phoenixes. Their removal is all burn-based and mostly deals with your mana dorks. They play few counterspells, usually just a couple spell pierces, although you do have to keep those in mind for Karn and Storm. Post-board, they get access to more and better counterspells though, and you have no choice but to jam threats into them similar to playing against Blue-White Control. Keep in mind when down-ticking Karn that even if you grab Tormod's Crypt, they can still just cast Phoenix normally and attack Karn for lethal. It's sometimes worthwhile to grab Heart of Kiran instead to block. Sometimes they'll try to keep you off Devotion by attacking into Cavalier with Phoenix and burning it after you block. Phoenix dying is nothing to them since they can just bring it back next turn, so consider whether to block carefully. Nykthos Ramp versus 4 to 5 color midrange. Fires and Nykthos are go-over-the-top value decks that start slow but outgrind everyone. It's important to try and win quickly because while you can generate value faster than they can, you can never outvalue them in the long run, and they have ways of heavily punishing your strategy. No matter if they use Enigmatic Incarnation, Transmogrify, or Bring to Light, these are all toolbox decks that have very punishing cards for them to tutor up. Things like Archon of Emeria, Agent of Treachery, Tidball, and Deadly Vanity. These decks also usually play exile-based removal like Chain to the Rocks, Leyline Binding, and Extinction Event that can answer anything you play. The good news is that they're usually also slow to set up in the early game, and you can take advantage of that by racing ahead. Nykthos Ramp vs Rakdos Sac. This is one of your better matchups, but you can still lose, primarily to Mayhem Devil, especially if you're heavily relying on mana dorks it can pick off. They can also generate a lot more damage than it appears with Devil, so make sure you take that into account. Depending on their resources, you can lose from as high as 14 plus life without even being attacked. Most of their game is slow and attrition-based, and most of their removal only hits small creatures. However, they can claim the firstborn your dorks or trolls and sacrifice them, in which case Troll doesn't come back to you. If they're on the Jund version, they get to put Troll on their own forest. Speaking of Jund, green versions are better at grinding through you, especially with Korvold. Post-board, they'll bring in more answers to your game plan, such as Thoughtseize, Go Blank, and Pithing Needle. You can Karn for Portable Hole or Needle to disable Witch's Oven, or Glass Casket or Sky Sovereign for Devil. Karn's Sylex is your best wish target if you can afford to lose your own mana ramp since it blasts everything. Nykthos ramp versus Lotus Field. This matchup completely revolves around landing Karn and fetching Damping Sphere to weaken Lotus Field. You can also get God Pharaoh statue, but it's not as good. The point is, you should mulligan to hands that ramp into Karn early or storm the festival. However, you still need to apply pressure since Lotus Field plays Boseiju and Otawara to deal with your artifacts and can tutor them with Sylvan Scrying. Keep in mind that Damping Sphere also shuts off Nykthos. Sometimes you'll have to weigh the likelihood of winning or getting enough mana to keep going versus playing it safe in the short term. Nykthos ramp versus Mono Red Aggro. As with all aggro decks, this is a bad matchup. They have a lot of cheap burn to deal with your Mono Dorks and a fast clock. Good hands to keep are those that can ramp into Troll or Cavalier quickly to block. Keep in mind that red comes in different flavors and may have more or less burn spells, go wide strats, or big threats. It's important to take into account how much damage you could potentially take from different positions, whether the opponent has Embercleave or Torbrand, or a density of burn spells. If possible, save Boseiju for Embercleave or Eidolon. As usual, board in most removal like Hole, Tolsimir, and Sky Sovereign. You can board out 1 to 2 Karns and trim some other slow cards like Oath. Oath is particularly bad against Eidolon. Teferi gains points if they're relying more on burn spells. Speaking of, it's better to gamble on the Teferi plus Chainveil combo since it's more difficult to set up the devotion needed for Karn loops. Worthwhile Karn wishes are Hole or Sky Sovereign for removal, Heart of Kirin or Essica's Chariot to block, and Restorative Burst to get out of burn range. Keep in mind that they'll likely board into cards that make your big creatures worse. Lava Coil can exile Troll, and Threaten effects steal your big blockers. Nykthos ramp versus Mono Blue Spirits. Again, aggro equals bad matchup. Troll, which is usually one of your best cards against aggro, is almost useless here. Most, if not all, of their creatures fly, meaning they're hard to block and the game can quickly slip away from you, especially if they land an early Curious Obsession. Even reach creatures are a non-issue for them due to Shacklegeist. The exact amount of counterspells they have varies, but they have enough and you have no choice but to jam threats into them. Their counterspells are usually all soft counters that can be sidestepped with mana payments, but you usually won't have the time to wait. Nevertheless, you can sometimes pay for them, and hands with a lot of ramp but no immediate payoff become more valuable. The important numbers are 1 or more mana for Mausoleum Wanderer, 3 for Geistlight Snare, and 4 for Lofty Denial. Post-board, they may gain hard counters like Disdainful Stroke or Aether Gust. Also, Spell Pierce occasionally at 2 mana. Board in Hole, Tolsimir, and Boat. Board out 1 to 2 Karns and trim something else like Troll. Nykthos ramp Mirror Match. This is basically a coin flip, both in terms of who's on the play and who can ramp faster or find their combo faster. Karn is your main point of interaction. It stops opposing activations from Chainveil and Pestilent Cauldron, meaning the opponent has to deal with it before they're able to combo. Depending on the situation, your wish targets are Portable Hole or Glass Casket to slow down the opponent's ramp by hitting Elves, Wolf Willowhaven, or Troll to remove 3 pips for Nykthos, Sky Sovereign to do the same and hit opposing Karns that have minused, Meteor Golem as an all-purpose answer, but mostly to hit Karn, or God Pharaoh Statue to hamper the opponent from developing a board or storming off. This is only good early and does little to slow down Nykthos. If the opponent's board is better than yours, or you're in danger of losing, you can hit the panic button by Karning for Damping Sphere to stop Nykthos, Pithing Needle naming Karn, or Sylex to reset everything. Your only other interaction is Boseiju, which should primarily be used to hit Nykthos, but you can also destroy any artifact your opponent tutors with Karn. Abzan Greasefang. Greasefang being a very linear deck, many matches will play out similarly. Start by planning the Greasefang combo, using various cards to mill or discard Parhelion, Grisly Salvage among them, which can also find Greasefang, or mill it over and retrieve it with Can't Stay Away. Also, Thoughtseize to disrupt the opponent or take their answer to your combo. The variables are what kind of answers the opponent has to you, how well they line up, and how many of them they have. Many times, especially in sideboard games, it's better to return Essica's Chariot with Greasefang rather than Parhelion, since if they have a way to kill Greasefang, you'll at least be left with the cat tokens and Chariot is more castable. Killing Greasefang with its trigger on the stack at the beginning of combat is better if it's returning Parhelion, since Parhelion then goes back to hand. If the target is Essica's Chariot, it's better to do it in the main phase to prevent them getting the cat tokens, but this opens up the possibility of casting another Greasefang or Can't Stay Away. Abzan Greasefang versus Rakdos Midrange. They don't have much mainboard to deal with the combo, mainly just Thoughtseize and Fatal Push if they can trigger Revolt. Even if they kill Greasefang, it's not too difficult to find another one or get it back with Can't Stay Away. If the Parhelion plan falls apart, you can still potentially overpower them with other threats like Essica's Chariot or Sky Sovereign. Bring in Abrupt Decay for Unlicensed Hearse and various permanents, along with Tamio's Safekeeping for protection. Some cards to watch out for are Abrade, Rending Volley, and Graveyard Trespasser. Post-board, they should be on full alert and bring in a ton of answers to your creatures in graveyard, so expect a grind. Greasefang versus Nykthos. This is one of your best matchups. They have very little to interact with you, primarily Karn if they're on the play. Even if they resolve Karn, you can often attack it to death. And on top of that, you have Thoughtseize to disrupt them. Post-board, they get almost nothing, usually just boarding in 1 to 2 artifacts like Tormod's Crypt and Pithing Needle. Bring in Duress for Karn and maybe some removal for Monodorks and graveyard-hating artifacts. Greasefang vs Aggro and CoCo. It depends on exactly which deck, but generally you're just trying to race them. Blue decks have some counterspells, but you have hand disruption and redundancy like Can't Stay Away. Non-blue decks have few ways to interact. White's only real way to slow you down is Thalia on the play, which taxes Grizzly Salvage and Can't Stay Away. After sideboarding, white decks get Rest in Peace, so be sure to bring in Abrupt Decay and similar answers. Red's main board burn spells all only deal 2 damage except for Lightning Strike, which are not enough to kill Greasefang. However, post-board they gain Rending Volley, so be sure to bring in Tamiyo's Safekeeping. Spirits has counterspells and may be able to lock out Parhelion with Shacklegeist. Regardless of which deck you're facing, you can bring in cheap removal to fight their creatures, especially on the draw when tempo is against you. Greasefang vs Blue-White Control. There are 2 ways to approach this matchup. The first is to race to Parhelion as normal. The other way is to try and grind them down via attrition using things like Can't Stay Away and Essica's Chariot. They have a lot of counterspells, instant speed and exile-based removal, and sweepers. You need to watch out for various counters, Wandering Emperor and March of Otherworldly Light. Post-board, they gain even more interaction and Rest in Peace. Bring in Answers to Rip, Duress, and possibly Tamiyo's Safekeeping if you see enough removal from their side. Greasefang vs Phoenix. Like most decks that face Izzet Phoenix, the main threat is Thing in the Ice, but it can be too slow to matter against you. They do have some main board removal for Greasefang. If you get to attack with Parhelion, they can't profitably block or attack into it anymore unless they're able to flip Thing in the Ice soon after. Use Thoughtseize to pluck answers out of their hand or nab Thing in the Ice or their powerful spells like Treasure Cruise. Post-board, they'll bring in more answers, so shift your mindset towards playing grindy. Abrupt Decay answers Shredder, Thing, and whatever graveyard hate they bring in, most likely Hearse. Bring in your own Hearses for Phoenix and to reduce Delve fodder, although you can't ever keep them off Delve for too long. Bring in Tamiyo's Safekeeping, Duress, and potentially Fatal Push depending on how many non-Phoenix threats it can hit. Greasefang vs 4 to 5 color midrange. Your greatest advantage is that they're quite slow to set up and generally don't have too much removal for Greasefang early on. The most likely card they have to interact with you early is Leyline Binding, so pay attention to their lands, and if they play Nylea's Presence, these are toolbox decks, but it's unlikely for them to have any individual tutorable card that severely punishes your strategy. Things should be good early, but will snowball out of your favor if they can stall long enough, so be aggressive. Use Thoughtseize to take their answers or main value engine, be it Bring to Light or Enigmatic Incarnation. Post-board, you need to be wary of Rending Volley and other removal, Go Blank, and possibly counterspells. The go-to for protection is Tamiyo's Safekeeping as usual. They'll almost certainly have permanent-based graveyard hate like Rest in Peace, so bring in Abrupt Decay. Greasefang vs Rakdos Sac. Their plan is slow, grindy attrition, which doesn't work so well when you can kill them in 2 turns. They may have a handful of removal spells, but you're mostly good to jam Greasefang as fast as possible. After sideboarding though, they'll bring in a ton of interaction and the matchup should get a lot grindier. Expect cards like Thoughtseize, Go Blank, Unlicensed Hearse, Pithing Needle, etc. Thankfully, your sideboard cards that answer their hate pieces like Abrupt Decay also answer their other threats like Devil and Oven. Greasefang vs Lotus Field. You're both combo decks, but thankfully you're faster and have more interaction. Their only real way of interacting in game 1 is Besage You, and all that does is delay for a turn. Even post-board, they barely get any more cards. Board in Duress and keep fast hands. Simple. Greasefang Mirror. Game 1 of the Mirror mostly comes down to who has the faster hand or can find Parhelion first. Although there's some interaction via Thoughtseize, it's mostly a coin flip for who goes first. Post-board, each player should be bringing in as much interaction as possible, especially on the draw. Cards like Fatal Push and Abrupt Decay for Greasefang, Hearse, and Terra Sunder for Parhelion. Mono-White Humans vs Rakdos Midrange. Your plan is to be aggressive, whereas theirs is to disrupt you and stabilize. They have a lot of cheap removal and decent blockers, so you can't expect anything of yours to stick around. Still, try to be fast and go wide. Certain creatures of yours, or in combination with pump effects like Thalia's Lieutenant, can survive mathematically limited removal like Bone Crusher Giant, but they have other, mostly unconditional removal, i.e. Push and Dreadbore. If played early, Dauntless Bodyguard can back up another aggressive creature. Otherwise, protect your bigger threats like Aspirant, Lieutenant, Thalia, or Adeline. Thalia can keep them off balance and wins in combat against their creatures if pumped once. Kalidas is their best creature against you, and the game will slip away quickly if you can't push past it in time or use Brutal Cathar. Brave the Elements can protect a creature or get past blockers to some extent. However, any creature you resolve can be killed by their plethora of removal, so you can't rely on anything sticking around. Expect more interaction and sweepers like Extinction Event post-board. Highly interactive matchups like this are where grindy cards such as Wedding Announcement come in, potentially Deckenstone as well to clear the way of blockers, especially Kalidas. Mono-White Humans vs Nykthos Ramp. This is one of your best matchups. They have nothing to interact with you early and block poorly. Thalia and your various other hate creatures slow down their big threats. Your ways of interacting with them are exile-based, getting around Death Triggers from Troll and Cavalier. Even if the game goes long, you can attack through them with Brave the Elements. Their main ways of fighting back are an early Troll to block with and Karn retrievables, including cheap removal like Portable Hole. If you're unable to kill them quickly, prioritize building up counters for Hopeful Initiate since it can destroy any artifacts tutored by Karn. You can bring in Deck and Stone for their big creatures, Hole for their early ramp, and any stacks cards you have, including Redain, Thalia, Heretic Cathar, Archon of Emeria, Containment Priest, and Rest in Peace. Rip blanks death triggers and stops the flashback on Storm the Festival. Containment Priest stops creatures entering from Storm. All other stacks cards slow them down and they can't combo through Rule of Law effects. Don't overboard though, the matchup is already good and you mostly just need to apply pressure. You can cut early drops that are otherwise too slow, bad at attacking through Troll, or which don't have any beneficial abilities to slow them down, especially on the draw. Mono White Humans vs Greasefang. The number one priority is stopping Parhelion. Unfortunately, you don't have many ways of doing that. Game 1 is going to be a race, and it's one you probably won't win. Hopeful Initiate can blow up vehicles, so it and cards that add counters are at a premium. One of your best sequences is turn 1 Initiate into turn 2 Aspirant. Rest in Peace is your best sideboard card to shut down their shenanigans. Containment Priest doesn't stop Greasefang's trigger, but it does stop Can't Stay Away. Thalia Heretic Cathar is a good stopgap since it makes Greasefang enter tapped and thus unable to crew whatever it brings back. It also slows down their land development since they're a 3-color deck. Apart from Parhelion, the other major threats they have are Esika's Chariot and Sky Sovereign, but these are all fought the same way. Declaration in Stone can exile not only Greasefang, but it also cleans up other creature tokens generated by Parhelion and Chariot. Your 1-drops besides Initiate are the cuts, since they're not fast enough to race Greasefang and they have plenty of fodder creatures to trade with. Mono White Humans vs Aggro and CoCo. The most important thing to figure out is who's the beatdown. It varies, but generally, who's ever on the play will have a better shot at being the aggressor, and the player on the draw will play defense. Games involve trading back and forth in combat or casting cheap removal to disrupt the opponent's board, either winning the damage race or developing a superior board state. This gets exacerbated after sideboarding when players cut their worst cards to bring in more interaction. White and red decks have cheap removal, while blue decks have counterspells. The blue decks also have flyers, so those games are all about racing. It's important to spread out +1 counters from Aspirant and Lieutenant, especially against red, which may have Goblin Chain Whirler. Be aware of which decks and cards can cause a sudden reversal on the board. Red may have Embercleave, Torbrand, or Hazaret. Green has CoCo. Spirits has Shacklegeist. White has Thalia's Lieutenant, Exile Creatures, and Brave the Elements. Brave the Elements is good for countering removal, winning combat encounters, or busting through board stalls. However, it's good when racing matters, but bad when board states matter. For example, in the Mirror, a superior board state is much more important since, unless you're literally one-shotting the opponent, you usually can't attack all out since it exposes you to losing on the backswing. In the Mirror, trading off your 1-drops is usually correct since fewer creatures on the opponent's side means less power from Thalia's Lieutenant, Aspirant, and Adeline. You also cut Brave against red since they have way too many cheap burn spells and you need to play out your creatures on curve. Brave stays in against Spirits because you need it to respond to Shacklegeist on the turn you attack all out. Wedding Announcement comes in against everything, especially red since the backside helps combat Chain Whirler. Similarly, the backside of Redain is highly effective against red. Thalia Heretic Cathar can help win races by hindering the mana development of multicolor decks and delaying blockers. It also stops haste creatures. Containment Priest comes in against CoCo, obviously. CoCo builds differ, but they're generally more about value, so it's important to race them before they can take over the board. Mono White Humans vs Blue-White Control. This is your typical aggro versus control matchup. You attack them, they cast removal and counterspells to stabilize. Apart from counterspells, including conditional ones like Censor and Dwari Disruption, there's a lot of instant speed tricks to be wary of, including various removal spells, the Wandering Emperor, Shark Tokens, and Settle the Wreckage. Your only real way of fighting back is Brave the Elements to protect against targeted removal, but their sweepers make it useless in the long run. Thalia also hampers their mana. Diversify which creatures you're pumping with Aspirant to get around single target removal, especially Wandering Emperor. Try not to overextend on creatures if you can help it, since you can be board wiped by Verdict, Farewell, etc. Dauntless Bodyguard and Kithian can help defend against Verdict. Your best cards are going to be those that present a must-answer threat or repeatable value, particularly Adeline and Wedding Announcement. Bring in any stacked creatures that may be helpful, such as Heretic Cathar and Redain. Hopeful Initiate can blow up artifact and enchantment-based removal like Portable Hole and D-Sphere, or Shark Typhoon if they hardcast it. Strangely enough, you should bring in your own Portable Holes to fight theirs and kill creature tokens since it's more mana efficient than Brutal Cathar. Speaking of, the easiest cuts are Brutal Cathar, then Brave the Elements if you need more space. Mono White Humans vs Phoenix. They have some cheap burn spells to fight back against your creatures, although high toughness ones can survive anything but Lightning Axe. Ledger Shredder and Thing in the Ice may also serve as decent blockers. The good news is they probably can't race you with Phoenix, and Thalia affects the majority of their deck. The bad news is Thing in the Ice flipping will kill you. The matchup is defined by Thing and makes Brutal Cathar important since, even if they kill it, you might at least get to reset Thing's counters. The same goes for Ledger Shredder. Board in anything that taxes them, eats graveyards, or gets rid of Thing in the Ice. Cards you should be looking at are Thalia Heretic Cathar, Archon of Emeria, Containment Priest, Rest in Peace, Portable Hole, and Deck and Stone. As usual, bring in Wedding Announcement. Board out your cheap, low-power creatures since they can't attack into X4s and die to burn spells, as well as Brave the Elements. Mono White Humans vs 4 to 5 color midrange. These matchups are all about racing them before they can establish their late game value engines. In this regard, Thalia is at a premium to slow them down, but most fast aggressive creatures will do. However, they do have certain cheap interaction, including Chain to the Rocks, Leyline Binding, Abrupt Decay, etc. Hopeful Initiate can destroy their enchantment-based removal and is particularly good against the Fires decks that rely on enchantments as their value engine. Niv to Light in specific is an awful matchup. They have multiple sweepers and 4 Bring to Lights to find them. Even with Thalia and other taxing effects, you can't keep them off their sweepers forever. Still, stacks cards like Big Thalia and Redain will do you well here. The more creature-based they are, the more valuable Deckenstone is. Containment Priest stops Enigmatic Incarnation and Transmogrify, but not Bring to Light since they have plenty of non-creatures to find, such as Tibalt. Conversely, Brutal Cathar is much worse against the spell-based piles. Brave the Elements isn't so good since they have sweepers and creatures of diverse colors. Speaking of sweepers, don't overextend against Bring to Light decks. Mono-White Humans vs Rakdos Sac. Their plan is to grind and win by attrition, which means you're the beatdown. Your X1 creatures are at their absolute worst here since they die to various tiny blockers, including Cauldron Familiar, and can be pinged by Mayhem Devil. Devil is their best card by far, and it's important to have a plan for it, usually Brutal Cathar and Declaration in Stone out of the sideboard, or getting your creatures out of range with Thalia's Lieutenant or Wedding Announcement. Don't be complacent with your creatures being 2 toughness though, since they have many ways to sacrifice multiple permanents in the same turn. If you run Redain, you can play it on its backside to completely hose Devil. All of your creatures are also susceptible to being stolen by Claim the Firstborn and sacked, so spread out your threats. Graveyard hate, such as Rest in Peace and Containment Priest, will stop the cat loops. Heretic Cathar also stops cat from blocking immediately. Portable Hole is important for hitting Witch's Oven, Oni Cult Anvil, and Trail of Crumbs in green versions. Deckenstone gets rid of Mayhem Devil and gets better the more token generators they play. Mono White Humans vs Lotus Field. A fantastic matchup for you. All you have to do is race them and they have practically nothing to interact with you apart from a few weak blockers. Plus, you have main deck Thalia to slow them down. Side in any stacks cards you have, such as Thalia, Heretic, Cathar, Redain, and Archon of Emeria. You can cut Brave the Elements since it does almost nothing, and Brutal Cathar if you need more room for sideboard cards. CoCo decks. A brief word on Collected Company. There are different CoCo decks, but they generally have similar game plans. They're creature-based decks that, as regards value, speed, and aggression, sit between the aggro decks and mid-range, specifically leaning on CoCo as a mid-game capper. The most popular variant is Bant Spirits, but there are multicolor humans builds similar to mono-white humans, as well as green-white Staxy decks. The CoCo decks are very similar to aggro decks in the format except with Collected Company, so rather than repeat myself, you can skip to those sections for matchup and sideboard guides. Bant Spirits is similar to mono-blue Spirits, except they don't play Curious Obsession and have fewer main deck counterspells, substituting them with Spell Queller. They also have Selfless Spirit and can use Collected Company as a trick, randomly hitting Queller, Selfless Spirit, and so on. For the humans variant, they're 90% similar to mono-white humans, with the big difference being a lack of Brave the Elements, so you can back up the video to that section. Blue-white Control vs Rakdos Midrange. The matchup is favored, but that doesn't mean you can let your guard down. You have counterspells, removal, good threats, and sweepers if they overextend. That said, they have a lot of threats, Thoughtseize, and Dreadbore for your walkers. They also have a number of 2-for-1 threats like Fable and Trespasser. Focus on keeping the board clear and use sweepers if things get out of hand. Sheoldred has to be killed on sight or else you'll run out of life quickly. Liliana can also be a pain if it sticks around. Use Field of Ruin to hit their man lands and castles. This matchup consists of a lot of value grinding, so bring in more counterspells, removal, and threats. Veto can also go since they don't have enough non-creature threats for it to be relevant. Cut Portable Hole since it doesn't affect most of their threats. Rest in Peace can come in depending on how many Graveyard Matters cards they have, some notable ones being Kroxa, Tenacious Underdog, and Hearse. Blue-white Control vs Nykthos Ramp. This is fairly even matchup-wise. Your best path to victory is countering their threats early and landing Teferi, then pulling ahead on cards while continuing to answer whatever threat they play. The big thing to understand about this matchup is that most of their cards don't matter. Monodorks? Ignore them. Troll? Doesn't matter. The only 2 actual cards you have to worry about are Karn and Storm the Festival since it can find Karn. Counterspell those and you're good. However, if you can interact with their ramp without any drawbacks, do it since one of the ways they can beat you is pulling ahead on mana and double spelling through your counters. Use Field of Ruin to pop Nykthos. If they manage to resolve Karn, their primary tutor choices are going to be God Pharaoh's Statue, Restorative Burst for value, or Needle or Sky Sovereign for your walkers. If they land Statue, you may still be able to interact with them to some degree. You can eventually get out of it with Detention Sphere by getting to 7 to 8 mana for Teferi or Farewell, or by pitching multiple white cards to March of Otherworldly Light. If they're foolish enough to animate Statue with Karn, you can kill it with creature removal like Fateful Absence, Verdict, or Wandering Emperor. Your single best card against them is Farewell since it mops up all their non-planeswalker permanents, their binge Storm the Festivals, and gets around the death triggers on Troll and Cavalier. For the same reason, bring in Rest in Peace since it stops death triggers, storm flashbacks, and prevents the restorative burst loop. Rip plus Verdict is a good combination. Although they're usually not aggressive enough for attacking with Troll or Cavalier to matter, the devotion they grant does matter. You can easily exile either creature with Wandering Emperor. For this reason, they probably won't attack into 4 open mana. Even if you don't have Emperor, just the possibility of having it can be enough to dissuade them from attacking. Post-board, bring in additional hard counterspells and big threats. Keep in mind they have Beseiju, so your temporary removal or Rest in Peace may be popped at any time. Blue-White Control vs Greasefang. Greasefang is the numero uno threat here. You can still potentially survive the Parhelion hit if you answer the Angel tokens in combat with something like March or Wandering Emperor, or rebound the following turn with Verdict, but it's better to answer things beforehand. Greasefang and other creatures can be brought back by Can't Stay Away. Thankfully, most of your removal exiles. Apart from that, Essica's Chariot is the second big threat, and they also have a number of random Deuter creatures like Rafine's Informant and Sated Wayfinder, whose damage can add up over time. Lastly, they have Thoughtseize to take your removal, counterspells, or threats. If you can stop them early and make it to the late game, you should be good. Board into Rest in Peace and additional counterspells and removal. Cut Portable Hole since it doesn't hit anything relevant. Blue-White Control vs Aggro and CoCo. It doesn't really matter which aggro deck it is, your plan is to trade counterspells and removal for threats as much as possible early on and stabilize into the late game when you can take over with Emperor, Teferi, or Shark Typhoon. Blue Spirits and CoCo decks can ambush you with threats at instant speed, thus taxing your counterspells. Blue decks also have counterspells of their own, either to fight back against yours or to stop your threats. Red is also vexing due to haste creatures and burn spells that give them reach even after you stabilize the board. For single target removal, Brave the Elements and Rattle Chains are the main ways for them to counter you. Keep in mind that pseudo-temporary removal like D-Sphere and Hole can be blown up by cards like Hopeful Initiate. Verdict is of course good against all these decks, though there are a number of ways to counteract it. White has indestructibility creatures like Dauntless Bodyguard, Kythian, and Selfless Spirit, and will board into Wedding Announcement. Red may have Anax or recursive creatures like Phoenix Chick and Squee. Spirits can't counter Verdict except in the case of Spell Queller. Field of Ruin can be used to hit manlands like Mutavault, Den of the Bugbear, and Faceless Haven. Side in any efficient removal, sweepers, or counterspells you have. Color hate spells like Aether Gust and Mystical Dispute come in their respective matchups. Bring in any anti-aggro threats you have, especially those with life gain like Lyra Dawnbringer or Dream Trawler. Rule of thumb is to cut slower cards. Veto specifically is quite bad since all these decks rely on creatures, even CoCo. Blue-White Control vs Izzet Phoenix. The early turns are spent setting up by both sides. Most of their threats are easily dealt with, even Phoenix since you have exile-based removal like Wandering Emperor. The thing you want to counter are their Delve spells. The main ways they're looking to get ahead of you are by overpowering you on cards with Treasure Cruise or Tempo with Trespass. If you can stop those, you should be good. Use Field of Ruin on Hall of Storm Giants. In Game 1, they have a lot of useless removal and only a couple Spell Pierces, but they side into more counterspells. You'll want Rest in Peace, more counterspells, and removal. Blue-White Control vs 4-5 color Midrange. Like many value-oriented matchups, your main path to victory is countering their early plays and trying to pull ahead on resources with things like Teferi. Absent that outcome, things will not go well for you. Let me make this clear, you cannot beat these decks in the long run unless you manage to get significantly ahead on resources. They have huge bomb threats that single-handedly win the game. Tibalt, Niv Mizzet, Kenrith, Koma, the Scarab God. Artifact and enchantment removal like March is particularly good against Fires. The main difference between them is that Fires is more of a mid-range value deck that relies on creatures, whereas Niv to Light is more of a spell-based control deck. Sweepers may be effective against Fires, but not Niv. However, even with Sweepers, they can generate so much value that it doesn't matter. They also have ways to get way ahead on mana via Ramp, Fires, and by cheating threats into play. They can also answer your threats at a discount, Leyline Binding, Dreadbore, etc. Thus, your plan needs to be to counter their big threats and try to take over with Teferi. Bring in more counterspells and threats. You can cut Portable Hole since it doesn't hit anything of significance, and Sweepers against Niv to Light. Blue-White Control vs Rakdos Sac. Their attrition plan of looping Cat or making tokens isn't so great since it gives you time to respond, so you're really only worried about Mayhem Devil and maybe Fable or Ob Nixilis. Portable Hole and March are excellent here for exiling Oven, Onicall Anvil, and Trail of Crumbs from green versions. Speaking of, green versions with Trail and Korvold are better at grinding, but you have plenty of answers to them. Field of Ruin hits their manlands and castles if they're running any. Post-board, expect them to bring in hand disruption like Thoughtseize and Go Blank. Bring in Rest in Peace since it stops cat shenanigans, and Aether Gust for their red spells. Blue-White Control vs Lotus Field. This matchup is very simple. Hold up counterspells for their big payoff spell or pour over the pages. Their only way to get past you is by generating enough mana to double spell through your counters with multiple Lotus Fields and Hidden Strings. Field of Ruin can hit Thespian stage in response to them targeting Lotus Field or if they're tapped out. You have a ton of cards to board out, basically any removal and sweepers. Bring in all your extra counterspells and threats. Rest in Peace for Lear isn't very good, but you have so many cards to board out that you'll probably have room for it. Blue-White Control Mirror Match. If you've ever played a Blue-White Control Mirror in any format, this is no different. For the uninitiated, the Mirror is one big game of chicken. Each turn consists mostly of draw, play a land, pass. Winning is usually a matter of having more mana, meaning hitting your land drops consistently is most important. Opening hands with a higher than normal amount of lands are better. The optimal play pattern is to do nothing for as long as possible, after which one of two things will happen. A player casts a threat and their opponent counters it, followed by playing their own threat and taking over the game, or a player plays a threat and protects it with a counterspell. Basically, you never want to be the player who pulls the trigger first and face plants. There are a number of cards with unique properties to discuss. One tactic is using instant speed spells on the opponent's end step, either baiting or forcing them into countering it. These are cards like Memory Deluge and Wandering Emperor. In the same vein, you can use uncounterable effects on their end step to generate a board via Castle Ardenvale or Cycling Shark Typhoon. Field of Ruin hits opposing castles and Hall of Storm Giants. Dovin's Veto counters a threat regardless of whether that player has protection for it. Otherwise, the player who gets ahead on land drops will probably win. Cut your near useless removal and sweepers. Sideboard every counterspell and threat. Anything that can't be countered or which has flash like Hullbreaker Horror is great. Speaking of, sideboard games are radically transformed by Hullbreaker Horror, changing from a game of chicken to a ticking clock since it's close to unbeatable. Izzet Phoenix vs Rakdos Midrange. This is a slugfest where you'll be trading resources back and forth. They have a lot of removal, Thoughtseize, and 2-for-1 threats. In terms of recurring Phoenix, they can hit them with Graveyard Trespasser or play Kalidas and follow up with removal, although in Trespasser's case, you can target it with removal and pitch Phoenix to its ward trigger. If they run Liliana, although you can also pitch Phoenixes to it, it can keep your cards low and edict solo creatures, including flipped Thing in the Ice. You can also pitch Phoenix to Kroxa. It'll be difficult to stick any of your threats, so you're better off going for the Treasure Cruise or Temporal Trespass plans. Be wary of Sheoldred since she heavily punishes Treasure Cruise and Ledger Shredder, whose Connive trigger is mandatory. Post-board, they should be bringing in a lot more removal, Hand Disruption, Graveyard Hate, and Extinction Event, which exiles all your creatures including Phoenix. You'll want to bring in additional threats like Young Pyromancer and any additional removal or counterspells relevant to the matchup. Cut Spell Pierce since they don't have enough non-creatures and the game should go long. Since you're bringing in more threats, you can cut some of your existing ones. Izzet Phoenix vs Nykthos Ramp. Burn their early Monodorks to slow them down, counter their bigger threats, especially Karn, and eventually take over the game with Thing in the Ice or Hall of Storm Giants plus Temporal Trespass. That's the plan. Apart from Trespass, Thing in the Ice is your best card in this matchup since it bounces their board and attacks for a large amount of damage. The bounce also costs them at least one turn since they have to waste time redeploying their Monodorks and other creatures. They can Karn for Tormod's Crypt, but they'll never be able to keep you off enough fodder for Delve long term. Even if they have something like Grafdigger's Cage, you still have other threats, particularly Thing in the Ice. The worst case is if they're able to resolve Godpharaoh's Statue since it severely restricts what you can do. Statue and other artifacts can be answered by Otawara and siding in a Braid. Phoenix can be recurred or even hard cast to kill off Karn since they'll almost always use it immediately, leaving it with 3 loyalty. It can be correct to attack into Cavalier with Phoenix and burn it afterwards to deprive them of 3 devotion, and besides, your Phoenix's dying doesn't matter since you can bring them back. However, generally Arclight Phoenix is a liability in this matchup and you should side out some of them. Side in every available counterspell you have. Remember that the only cards you actually have to counter are Karn and Storm the Festival since Thing in the Ice takes care of everything else. Izzet Phoenix vs Greasefang. Like every other deck that goes against it, the #1 priority is killing Greasefang before it can return and crew Parhelion or Chariot. If they do manage to Parhelion you can still potentially make a comeback if you can flip Thing in the Ice fast enough. Thing in the Ice is great in general for bouncing all their tokens. However, many of their creatures milled them into the Greasefang combo, so be careful about returning them for them to reuse. After sideboarding, they gain more hand disruption, protective cards, removal, and graveyard hate for your Phoenixes and Delve spells. Bring in graveyard hate, instant speed removal for Greasefang, and a Braid. You can cut Ledger Shredder. Phoenix vs Aggro and CoCo. You become the control deck, trying to burn or block as many of their creatures as possible. Don't attack with Phoenix unless you're comfortably ahead. Trade it off to minimize their board presence. Thing in the Ice is your best card for obvious reasons, and it also blocks well against the non-blue decks. Conversely, Phoenix and Shredder get a lot better against the blue deck since they have flyers. Against mono-white humans, it's good to have a diversity of creature colors to mitigate the damage they can do with Brave the Elements. Mono-white shouldn't have much removal in game 1, but they do have Brutal Cathar, which can reset the counters on Thing and Ledger Shredder even if you kill it. However, if you can remove Cathar in response to its trigger, your creature won't leave play and thus will retain its counters. Against the other white decks, you can throw that advice out the window if the removal creature is Skyclave Apparition or Reflector Mage. Keep in mind what instant speed responses each deck can have to your removal spells. White has Brave the Elements, green has CoCo, blue has various counterspells and Rattle Chains. Against spirits, Shacklegeist can be a big problem both on offense and defense. The blue decks have various counterspells to contend with. Bant Spirits not so much, but they do have Spell Queller and Collected Company to act as a response of sorts. The red aggro decks have different builds, but the main thing to worry about is sudden burst damage from cards like Embercleave and Torbrand, or Eidolon. Bring in as much removal as possible and color-specific counterspells like Aether Gust and Mystical Dispute depending on the matchup. A Braid doubles as a removal spell for creatures and Portable Hole if they bring it in. Young Pyromancer can be good for generating more blockers against the non-blue decks. Cut Spell Pierce obviously. The other easiest cuts are either Ledger Shredder or Phoenix against the non-flyer decks. Avoid playing out multiples of the same creatures against white if possible, since they'll probably bring in Declaration in Stone. Keep in mind that Thing in the Ice's front and backside technically have different names. Phoenix vs Blue-White Control. The early turns are spent setting up by both sides. They have a lot of ways to deal with your threats between Portable Hole, March, D-Sphere, Wandering Emperor, Verdict, and counterspells. The fact that a lot of their removal exiles is a problem for Phoenix. It's going to be very difficult to stick any threats, even recurred Phoenixes, so you're better off trying to maneuver into a position where you can successfully resolve the Delve spells. You have a lot of useless burn spells that get cut for games 2 and 3. Bring in counterspells and more threats. Be especially wary of Rest in Peace postboard since it shuts off your Delve spells and recurring Phoenix. Izzet Phoenix versus 4 to 5 color midrange. A lot of their removal is exile based, including Chain to the Rocks, Leyline Binding, and Vanishing Verse. Thing in the Ice is substantially better against fires, which relies on creatures unlike Niv to Light. Bring to Light decks also typically have a sweeper package that includes Extinction Event. However, things even out postboard since you gain more counterspells for BTL but still don't have any removal for enchantments. Enigmatic Incarnation has a creature toolbox that will definitely include removal. They also have spell hate like Archon of Emeria and Campbell. You can probably cut Phoenix outright since they'll bring in graveyard hate on top of their exile removal, and they have big flyers like Niv Mizzet. Cut creature removal against Bring to Light, bring in counterspells and more threats. Izzet Phoenix versus Rakdos Sac. Their attrition game plan is pretty poor against you. Cauldron Familiar can't even block well against anything but Thing in the Ice. Thing in the Ice also bounces any other creature tokens they may have made from Onikel Anvil or Fable. There are only really 2 cards to worry about. The first is Mayhem Devil if it gets out of hand, which it can, quickly, so make sure you have removal for it. The other is Claim the Firstborn in combination with any sacrifice effect, stealing Ledger Shredder or Thing in the Ice. Remember that Thing still has a mana value of 2 when flipped, so they can steal it and hit you hard if you don't have another creature to block with. Expect them to get a lot more interactive in Game 2 when they bring in Hearse, Thoughtseize, Go Blank, Extinction Event, etc. Don't bother bringing in your own Graveyard Hate since Cat is still hard to interact with and it isn't enough of a threat alone. However, do bring in Graveyard Hate if they're running more Graveyard Matters cards like Kroxa. Bring in a Braid since it hits Devil, Oven, and Anvil. Aether Gust can also delay Devil for a turn. Cut Ledger Shredder since it's a liability against Claim the Firstborn. Izzet Phoenix versus Lotus Field. Game 1 is a race since you have nothing that interacts with them except a couple Spell Pierces. You want either a fast Thing flip or to recur multiple Phoenixes and then close the game out with Trespass. Things get better after sideboarding, but it's still a race. Cut all your removal and bring in every available counterspell. The main cards you're looking to counter are Hidden Strings, Pour Over the Pages, and Emergent Ultimatum. If you still have space to fill, you can bring in additional threats or Unlicensed Hearse to worsen Leer. They have a few cards to bring in but remain mostly the same between games. Izzet Phoenix Mirror Match. Like Rakdos midrange, the Mirror is a slugfest. Removal, while still necessary, becomes worse as Phoenix is brought back over and over. Phoenixes also trade with each other. Thing in the Ice is worse since it doesn't bounce other things, and bouncing Phoenix isn't much help. However, it still bounces the other creatures and is a huge threat that survives burn spells. You'll need to bring in Graveyard Hate and counterspells to fight on the stack. Treasure Cruise and Temple Trespass are the big haymakers in this matchup and you can't let them resolve. Also, bring in your sideboard threats like Pyromancer, Chandra, Crackling Drake, etc. Cut your low-end burn, e.g. Fiery Impulse. If you have removal that exiles, like Spikefield Hazard or Flame Blessed Bolt, they can help exile Phoenixes in Game 1, but are still probably better off sided out. 4 to 5 color midrange. Any value-oriented, high-mana midrange deck could be included in this archetype, but to be clear, I'm referring specifically to Fires of Invention variants, primarily playing Enigmatic Incarnation, and Bring to Light decks. While there are differences between them, they play out in largely similar ways and have similar matchups. The main difference is that Bring to Light and Transmogrify variants are more like spell-based control decks with few creatures, and other builds like Enigmatic Incarnation are more about mid-rangey creatures and board presence. Regarding sideboarding, these are toolbox decks and thus should have a handful of silver bullet cards that can come out in most matchups. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Rakdos midrange. Similar to Nykthos ramp, your goal is to delay them to the late game since they can't compete with your value cards. On their side, they're trying to disrupt you with Thoughtseize and apply enough pressure to prevent you from getting there. Bring to Light can grab various board wipes, and both decks can tutor giant bombs. Fires in particular has a number of creatures that make Rakdos practically lose on the spot, such as Koma, Scarab God, and Kenrith. They also have a number of mediocre removal spells like Fatal Push and Bone Crusher Giant. They're likely to swap them for better cards, but they don't have anything great, with Extinction Event probably being their best option. Your deck should have a handful of bad cards that can be sided out for better threats, likely Silver Bullets that are ineffective against Rakdos. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Nykthos ramp. You're both go-over-the-top value decks, so whomever gets to their value engine first wins. Your goal should be to slow down their development, especially by killing mana dorks. Even exiling Old Growth Troll can be beneficial to reduce their devotion. Bring to Light benefits enormously from having Extinction Event. Additionally, if you run an extraction effect like on Mordigo, you can name Karn or Nykthos and win on the spot. If you're on Enigmatic Incarnation, you can tutor Archon of Emeria, followed by Kenrith, which also effectively wins on the spot. Keep in mind that Beseiju can destroy your enchantment-based removal. Bring in cheap removal for Mana Dorks, Hand Disruption, Counterspells, and Rest in Peace to stop death triggers and Storm the Festival. Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage also reduce the power of Storm. If you have Artifact removal, bring it in. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Greasefang. I feel like a broken record when it comes to fighting Greasefang, but 95% of this matchup is just making sure to kill Greasefang on time or sniping Parhelion out of the graveyard. Instant speed removal is at an extremely high premium. Bring Delight benefits from having access to sweepers. You can potentially live through a Parhelion hit if you're able to wipe out both Greasefang and the Angel tokens afterward, e.g. with Supreme Verdict. Certain creatures and fires are similar, such as Deputy of Detention. If you run an extraction effect, you can name Greasefang and cut them off their best game plan. Bring in Graveyard Hate and Weathered Runestone, instant speed removal that kills Greasefang or artifacts, and basically anything else that stops their combo. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Aggro and CoCo. You're firmly in the role of the control deck, doing your best to block and remove their early creatures and delay to the late game. Bring Delight generally has an enormous advantage over Fires due to its plethora of sweepers. Even white taxing effects can't keep you off sweepers forever. Blue decks with counterspells are harder to navigate though. However, Fires has big blockers, including those with reach or flying for the Spirits decks and life gain creatures like Tulsamir. In this regard, Fires can perform better against red, especially low to the ground versions relying on burn spells. Bring in all forms of removal and threats that stabilize against aggro. You can bring in Hand Disruption against blue to take their counterspells. As usual, cut whatever Silver Bullet toolbox cards don't apply in a given matchup, then slow, high mana value cards. 4 to 5 color midrange versus blue-white control. This matchup can be frustrating since they have a multitude of counterspells for your value engines and threats, and a bunch of removal and sweepers, and pull ahead with their own threats like Wandering Emperor and Teferi. Additionally, creature removal like Chained to the Rocks is useless here. Your plan should be to get ahead on mana with your early ramp cards and try to overpower their counterspells, either by double spelling or by just jamming threats into them over and over until one sticks. Fires is at a disadvantage as regards blue-white control having a number of sweepers for their creatures, but Bring Delight is more susceptible to counterspells. If you manage to resolve a value generator like Fires, Enigmatic Incarnation, or Niv Mizzet, you can proceed to overpower them on card advantage. Your best options for threats are things that demand an answer on their own, like Coma, Agent of Treachery, etc. Keep in mind for Nylea's presence and domain for Leyline Binding that blue-white control plays Field of Ruin. Blue-white control also has enchantment removal for Binding, Fires, etc. Speaking of, all of these decks are playing some number of temporary removal spells in Leyline Binding, Detention Sphere, and so on, which can layer on top of each other, alternating back and forth for whose threat is live at any given moment. Priority on extraction effects like Slaughter Games is Teferi, with their other threats mattering a lot less. If you have 2 extraction effects for some reason, the next best threats are probably Shark Typhoon or Hullbreaker Horror post-board. Post-board, everyone should be cutting low-end removal and mediocre toolbox cards for more threats, counterspells, Hand Disruption, and removal that hits more than creatures. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Izzet Phoenix. A lot of your removal exiles, including Chained to the Rocks, Leyline Binding, and Vanishing Verse, which are good versus Arclight Phoenix. Also, Bring Delight finds Extinction Event. Either deck is capable of tutoring removal or very threatening cards. For example, Skyclave Apparition or Archon of Emiria to neuter Phoenix's multi-spell plan. Thing in the Ice is substantially better against Fires, which relies on creatures unlike Nykthos. However, things even out post-board since Phoenix gains more counterspells for BTL but still doesn't have any removal for enchantments. Bring in counterspells, removal, Hand Disruption, and Graveyard Hate for Phoenix and Delve spells. If you're going to extract a card, your best bet is probably Temporal Trespass. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Rakdos Sac. The only threat you really need to worry about is Mayhem Devil, as their attrition plan is far too slow to stop you. You have exile-based removal and removal that can get rid of non-creatures like Oven. They can't go wide since your sweepers mop them up. This is also where Silver Bullet creatures are incredible. Yasharn completely hoses their deck. For Fires, be somewhat wary of playing 3-drops since they can steal them with Claim the Firstborn. Still, even if they do, it's not the worst. The matchup is already good, but you can bring in Graveyard Hate, cheap removal, and Silver Bullets. Cut Trial of Ambition if you're running it, they have too many creatures for Edicts to work. 4 to 5 color midrange versus Lotus Field. This matchup is basically a race, but rather than being about dealing lethal damage, it's a race to cripple their ability to win. The unfortunate thing is that all your creature removal and sweepers are dead cards. As much as possible, you'll have to interact with their hand on the stack or via tax effects. Anything that taxes or shuts down casting multiple spells in a turn, or searching the library, or stopping extra mana production are effective. Cards like Archon of Emiria, Ashiok Dreamrender, and Damping Sphere. If you have extraction effects, you can name either their main engine card, usually Emergent Ultimatum, or their only win condition, likely Mastermind's Acquisition. You have a ton of dead cards, so bring in basically your entire sideboard as long as a card is of at least some use. Leyline Binding and Vanishing Verse are your least bad removal spells since they at least hit Leer and Omniscience. 4 to 5 color midrange mirror matches. These are straight up value grindfests primarily determined by who gets ahead on mana or establishes their value engine first. In some circumstances, a player may snowball ahead. In other circumstances, the board can get clogged by piles of creatures on both sides. Graveyards matter to some degree as the decks have bombs like Scarab God and Kenrith and can be countered by cards like Lotus. Low-end removal like Abrupt Decay are bad, and most creature removal is bad in general against Bring Delight, whereas the kind that exile are important for Fires. Extraction effects are also bad since the threats are too diverse and hitting the value engine doesn't stop the deck. Bring in hard counterspells and removal that can hit bigger threats. Bring in sweepers against Fires. Enchantment removal is useful for hitting the value engines in Fires, but also the enchantment-based removal in both decks like Leyline Binding. Lastly, bring in more threats. Rakdos Sac. Rakdos Sacrifice is an attrition deck built around abusing sacrifice effects. The main payoff is Mayhem Devil, without which the deck would be unplayable. Frequent play patterns are looping Cauldron Familiar with Witch's Oven, slowly accumulating value with Onikel Anvil or Ob Nixilis, and stealing small creatures with Claim the Firstborn and then sacrificing them to Oven, Deadly Dispute, or Nixilis. There's also a Jund version which may splash green just for Corvold as a second payoff, or incorporate it along with Trail of Crumbs and/or Gilded Goose. The main board is frequently lacking enough ways to interact with the opponent and must adapt after sideboarding. Rakdos Sac versus Rak Mid. Because the only real threat you have is Mayhem Devil, it's fairly simple for Rakdos Midrange to manage you. Bloodtithe Harvester and Bone Crusher Giant generally can't hit it, but Push and Dreadbore can. The Jund version is grindier and better able to keep up with Rakdos Midrange. Kalitas is a substantial hindrance to your sac shenanigans. When possible, sacrifice creatures before artifacts before Kalitas hits the field. Although it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to keep you from looping Cat, it's nowhere near fast enough to race them. Make sure the timing of your Cat activations and number of food tokens mean they can't snipe it out of the graveyard with cards like Hearse. Claim the Firstborn can steal many of their creatures, the best ones being Fable and the tokens it makes, followed by Bloodtithe Harvester. Keep in mind that double triggers for both players, meaning their blood, treasure, and reflection tokens can be a liability. Rakdos Sac versus Nick Ramp. One of your worst matchups. You're trying to win a long, grindy game, whereas they're racing to a combo. Karn also shuts down all your artifacts. Oven, Anvil, Food, Blood, and Treasure tokens, nothing works. Use removal spells, Claim the Firstborn, and Mayhem Devil to hit their mana dorks as best you can. You can also claim and sack Old Growth Troll. If you're playing Jund, you get to return Troll to your own forest. You cannot win the long game absent crazy multi-devil draws, so board into Hand Disruption and anything that gets rid of their creatures like Thoughtseize, Go Blank, Extinction Event. Slower cards like Voldaren Epicure can bite it. Rakdos Sac versus Ab Grease. Stopping Greasy Gratman's the plan. Unfortunately, you don't have much that does that, maybe a handful of Fatal Pushes or other removal. Once again, you can't win the race, and if Parhelion gets a hit in, you're probably dead. Bring in every possible answer for Greasefang and their vehicles, Graveyard Hate, Removal, Hand Disruption, and Pithing Needle. Cut Claim the Firstborn since it's not worth stealing most of their creatures, and Greasefang should have already done its damage. If you make it to the mid-game, Mayhem Devil may be able to pick off various other creatures in the deck like Satyr Wayfinder and Cat tokens. Rakdos Sac versus Aggro and CoCo. It's nearly impossible to race Aggro. Although you have many dinky blockers, all of which you're fine with losing, none of them are large enough to actually trade with Aggro's creatures except at the very beginning of the game against some X1s. White and even red quickly outgrow them and they do nothing to stop flying spirits. Along the same lines, Cauldron Familiar can block the biggest ground creature forever, but all these decks go wide. Mayhem Devil and Claim the Firstborn are the linchpins of these matchups, although even the Devil's Pings can be outgrown by Thalia's Lieutenant, Supreme Phantom, and so on. If you can stabilize, your attrition plan will eventually get there, so you should focus on killing every single creature you can. Consequently, your opponent will be very interested in getting rid of Devil. You may need to save removal for Brutal Cathar or Spell Queller. Remember that Deadly Dispute Sacrifice is a cost of casting the spell, and don't play into potential counterspells from the blue decks. Board into whatever removal you have, especially sweepers. Rakdos Sac versus Blue-White Control. Although an attrition plan and recurable creatures should hypothetically be good against control, they have numerous all-purpose and exile-based answers for your engine pieces like Portable Hole, March, and D-Sphere. You're also not fast enough to race them before they land Wandering Emperor or Teferi. You want to start the Cat or Anvil engine and then land a more substantial threat like Devil, Ob Nixilis, or Corvold as fast as possible. Alternatively, use your dinky attrition cards to run them out of removal and then try to resolve a big threat. Like with all grindy matchups, Trail of Crumbs assists with keeping up. Remember that Deadly Dispute Sacrifice is a cost of casting the spell, so don't play into a potential counterspell. Cut your dead removal and claim the Firstborns for Hand Disruption. Rakdos Sac versus Phoenix. Unlike the other grindy decks, your threats line up much better with their removal, including Thing in the Ice since you can loop Cat to block it. Claim the Firstborn is excellent against their non-Phoenix threats, especially stealing a flipped Thing in the Ice, clocking them for 7, then sacking it. However, you do need to pressure them or you'll eventually lose to Treasure Cruise and Temporal Trespass. Board in Hand Disruption and Graveyard Hate. Certain removal and sweepers also help, especially Extinction Event since their creatures are even and yours are mostly odd. Rakdos Sac versus 4-5 color midrange. More atrocious matchups similar to Nykthos Ramp. They're actually worse because not only do they have cheap removal to interact with you and your engine pieces, they may also have silver bullets like Isharn that straight up KO you. Your removal mostly sucks, including Claim the Firstborn, especially against Bring Delight, which runs few creatures. Not gonna lie, you probably just can't win. Nevertheless, board into hand disruption. Rakdos Sac vs Lotus Field. A race you're likely to lose. Your removal and claims basically do nothing except maybe get rid of an Arboreal Grazer. Mulligan aggressively for Mayhem Devil and board into hand disruption. Rakdos Sac vs Rakdos Sac. The Mirror is all about Mayhem Devil. Whoever sticks Devil wins. All removal must be held for Devil, all Devils must be played around removal. Devil is love, Devil is life. The Jund version has an advantage in Trail of Crumbs and especially Korvold, particularly because Korvold can't be claimed, unlike Devil. Hand disruption can be brought in to eliminate the opponent's Devils and other high priority targets, or to take their early removal to protect your own Devils. Lotus Field. Lotus Field is an extremely linear combo deck and has very little interaction. I won't break down the deck here as you can watch my primer on it, but rather I'll highlight the most important cards and interactions in a given matchup. The sideboard breaks down into a few categories: anti-aggro cards, anti-counterspell cards, grindy cards, specific answers to hate pieces or combos, and tutor targets and win cons. The general rule is that you're a tightly packaged combo deck and can't cut much when sideboarding, but Arboreal Grazer can go in matchups where blocking or racing doesn't matter. If you have multiple sideboard cards with the same effect, you can sideboard all but one, leaving the last one as a wish target for Mastermind's acquisition. Lotus Field vs Rakdos Midrange. The major cards here are hand disruption spells Thoughtseize, followed by Liliana and Kroxa. Sheoldred can also be a problem vis-a-vis Pour Over the Pages and Cycling Vizier. Their plan is primarily to try and take you off important spells early with Thoughtseize and then close out the game with aggressive creatures. After sideboarding, they get more hand disruption via Duress and possibly Go Blank. The good news is that, for the most part, outside of Thoughtseize, they don't have much to hinder you and they have a good number of dead removal spells. Keep in mind that you can use Otawara to get rid of things temporarily, especially good on higher cost cards like Sheoldred, and Boseiju can hit Fable if needed. You can also side in Supreme Verdict and other big threats like Elder Gargaroth or Zakama to beat back their creature plan. Lotus Field vs Nykthos Ramp. The most important card is Karn, which finds Damping Sphere to shut off the extra mana and colors from Lotus Field, and Godpharaoh's Statue as an additional taxer. Thankfully, they only have one of each, and you can use Boseiju or Otawara to get rid of them. And that's it. The matchup is a race to see who can go off first. Lotus Field vs Greasefang. Unfortunately, you're both combo decks, but they're usually faster and have Thoughtseize. While you can use Boseiju to delay them for a turn, it's only for one turn. Bring in answers to Parhelion or Greasefang, either Graveyard Hate, instant speed removal, or ways to stop crewing vehicles like Pithing Needle. Post-board, they'll gain more hand disruption. You may be able to use Verdict to sweep up Greasefang and any Angel or Cat tokens they've generated, but in general, you're better off trying to answer Greasefang before they can crew and focus on comboing. Also, be aware they may play Silence and can therefore mess with you on your combo turns, so don't expend more resources than you need to. Lotus Field vs Aggro and CoCo decks. Because you have such little interaction, your main goal is to race them to the combo. Arboreal Grazer and possibly Vizier can block, but not well and not for long. Keep in mind that Mono White has Thalia to slow you down and Brave the Elements in Game 1 to attack through your blockers. Any white creature deck can play various hate cards like Archon of Emeria or Redain that you'll have to deal with. Red aggro gets haste creatures and burn spells for reach. They may also play Eidolon or cards that can do burst damage out of nowhere like Embercleave or Torbrand, but you can answer these cards with Boseiju or Otawara. The blue decks have counterspells, but many of them are conditional on mana payments and can be maneuvered around with Lotus Field or Hidden Strings. Remember these numbers. Mausoleum Wanderer is 1 or 2 if they flash in a spirit. Spell Pierce is 2, Geistlight Snare and Mystical Dispute are 3, Lofty Denial is 4. Spell Queller only hits spells with mana value 4 or less, meaning Pour Over the Pages and your high-end spells get past it. Obviously though, there are still hard counters you can't get around like Disdainful Stroke. Bring in Sweepers and any life gain or damage prevention cards. Elder Gargaroth can be a house against aggro. Counterspells like Mystical Dispute come in against blue counterspell decks like Spirits. Uncounterable spells like Verdict and Sphinx of the Final Word also come in against Spirits. Since you don't cut Grazer, you can shave on slower cards like Impulse. Lotus Field vs Blue-White Control. While they do have a lot of dead removal and sweepers, they also have a lot of counterspells and bring in more after sideboarding. This isn't a matchup where you can combo quickly. Expect games to go long. You're trying to play slow and steady and eventually overpower them with more mana. You can use Hidden Strings and Vizier to generate a bunch of mana and then cast 2 spells in one turn, straining their ability to counter both of them. You can also bait them with a spell to lure out counters and then cast the spell you actually want next turn. They don't have infinite counterspells and will run out eventually. Censor and Drawry Disruption can be sidestepped with a mana payment, but Veto and other hard counters can't. The worst situation is if they manage to keep up their land drops and get ahead on cards with something like Teferi or Memory Deluge. Your sideboard should have a number of protective counterspells of your own, such as Mystical Dispute, along with matchup breakers like Sphinx of the Final Word and Thought Distortion, which you should board in. Also, bring in indie grindy value cards like Gargaroth or Zakama. Cut Grazer. Lotus Field vs Izzet Phoenix. Their removal is dead, and your combo should be faster than their pressure. The only thing they have to fight you with in Game 1 is a couple of Spell Pierces. After sideboarding though, they should have more counterspells. Apart from Phoenix rushing you, their fastest method to win is flipping Thing in the Ice and taking extra turns. If you have any graveyard hate or creature removal, bring it in. Sweepers are no good since Phoenix will just come back next turn. Bring in Mystical Dispute to counter their counters, counter Thing in the Ice, and counter the Delve spells. Bring in Elder Gargaroth if you run it. Lotus Field versus 4 to 5 color midrange. They're slow and primarily built around interacting with creatures, which is useless against you. Keep in mind though that these are toolbox decks and as such may have certain tutorable silver bullets for you like Archon of Emeria, Campbell, or Extraction effects, although Otawara can bounce hate permanents. In the case of Fires, Boseiju and Otawara can answer their enchantments, and it's important to bring in other enchantment hate for them. Lotus Field versus Rakdos Sac. Their attrition plan should generally be slower than your combo plan unless they get an early or multiple Mayhem Devils. Although Devil isn't interactable aside from Otawara, you can hit their artifacts like Witch's Oven with Boseiju. It may be worthwhile to bring in additional artifact or enchantment hate, especially if they're playing Fable, Onikul Anvil, or Trail of Crumbs. If you have any cards that kill Devil or prevent them from looping Cat, you can bring them in as they may make them too slow to stop you. Grazer is still somewhat good in that it can block the little attacks from Cat and other dinky creatures like Voldaren Epicure or Unlucky Witness. Post-board, they should bring in Hand Disruption which, while good against you, does water down their aggression. Lotus Field, the Mirror Match. Like the Nykthos Mirror, this is just a race. It's more important to keep fast hands than resilient ones since there's almost nothing either player can do to stop their opponent's combo. Bring in whatever counterspells you have and cross your fingers. Mono Red Aggro. Mono Red has the greatest variety among aggro decks of different builds and individual card differences. The main two versions are a low to the ground version that plays a lot more burn spells, and a more mid-rangey version that plays big burst damage cards like Embercleave, Torbrand, Hazoret, etc. Pure Burn is better against decks you need to race or which have a lot of removal, and Bigger Red is better against slower mid-range decks and those with few or no removal spells. Mono Red Aggro versus Rakdos Midrange, Phoenix, and Blue-White Control. The game plan in all scenarios is to try and race them before they can stabilize. Every one of these matchups has some combination of removal and blockers to try and delay things to the mid to late game where their big bombs can take over. In all cases, the creature-oriented versions of Red are at a disadvantage over burn versions. Some cards to be wary of are Kalidas and Sheoldred for their life gain and blocking, Wandering Emperor for similar reasons, and Thing in the Ice flipping. Post-board, Blue-White Control can gain access to immediate lights-out life gain bombs like Lyra Dawnbringer and Dream Trawler. Bring in Graveyard Hate against Phoenix and bigger red removal like Lava Coil against Rakdos and Phoenix. You can cut your slowest creatures or weakest burn spells, especially on the draw. Mono Red Aggro versus Nykthos Ramp. This is a good matchup since they're slower than you, have almost no removal, and are bad at blocking outside of Old Growth Troll. You can pick off their Monodorks to slow them down without slowing yourself down much. This is a great matchup for Goblin Chainwhirler if you have it. If they manage to stabilize with blockers or by carning for removal, you can still push through in a number of ways, with burn spells for reach, by going wide, or with burst damage cards like Embercleave and Torbrand. The death triggers on Troll and Cavalier can be circumvented by Lava Coil and Kumano's backside. Soulscar Mage can reduce the power and toughness of Troll and Cavalier even if you can't kill them outright. Bring in Lava Coil for Troll and Threaten effects for Troll and Cavalier. You can cut your slowest creatures or weakest burn spells, especially on the draw. Mono Red Aggro versus Greasefang. Killing Greasefang is your #1 priority since you can't race Parhelion. Unfortunately, many of Pioneer's burn spells can't do that. The ones that can are primarily Lightning Strike and Sideboard Rending Volley. You can also combine lesser burn spells with Soulscar Mage to reduce Greasefang's power so they can't crew. Besides their main combo, Greasefang has a number of dinky creatures and Esika's Chariot tokens that can trade with your smaller attackers. Apart from Rending Volley, side in anything that kills Greasefang at instant speed, and Graveyard Hate. Lava Coil may be worthwhile to keep them from recurring creatures via Can't Stay Away, which is also another benefit of Kumano's backside. You can cut your smallest creatures and burn spells that don't hit Greasefang. Mono Red Aggro versus Aggro and CoCo. Against opposing aggro decks, the first thing to figure out is who's the beatdown. That is, which deck is playing the normal role of aggro and which is playing defense. That'll normally be a play-draw distinction, but not always. These matchups involve a lot of flinging removal and trading off creatures. In the case of spirits, since you can't block them, it's a race. Board stalls can be broken by Embercleave, Torbrand, Brave the Elements, and Shacklegeist. Because your removal is all burn-based, various creatures are liable to outgrow their reach. Some creatures are just naturally too high toughness, other times they can pump their board with Thalia's Lieutenant or Supreme Phantom. Keep in mind what responses they can have to your removal. White has Brave the Elements, blue has straight-up counterspells and Rattle Chains. If white uses Brave the Elements defensively in combat to make a bunch of blocks, you can stop the damage prevention with Bone Crusher's spell mode. Soulscar Mage can reduce the stats of creatures even if you can't kill them outright. Goblin Chainwhirler is a boon regardless of which deck you're facing. Bring in more removal, including Rending Volley when appropriate. Cut your worst, smallest creatures. Mono Red Aggro versus 4 to 5 color midrange. You must race these decks as you cannot beat them in the mid to late game. The benefit against these decks is that they can be slow to set up, although they do have some efficient removal like Chain to the Rocks. Both decks may have Sylvan Caryatid as a hexproof ramp card that blocks. Bring to Light has a suite of sweepers. Fires is the scarier deck as they have various tutorable life gain creatures that are an immediate KO. If they play Kenrith with Fires and have mana up to gain life, or Incarnation a Leyline Binding into Titan of Industry, you lose on the spot. Unfortunately, there's not much you can bring in. Keep fast hands and hope to race them. Mono Red Aggro vs Rakdos Sac. There's not much you can do about their game plan, so instead I'll highlight things to be aware of. The Cat Loop is one of their best plays against you for its ability to continuously block and gain life. There's really no way for you to stop it if they're playing correctly. They have various other small blockers like Voldaren Epicure, Unlucky Witness, and Anvil tokens. Removal, Claim the Firstborn, and Mayhem Devil are all ways for them to get rid of your creatures. Some Jund versions play Gilded Goose and Trail of Crumbs, which add to their food count along with Oven to gain life and get out of burn range. Ob Nixilis and Anvil also gain life. Mono Red Aggro versus Lotus Field. Race them, that's it. They've got Arboreal Grazer to block with and no other interaction. They're trying to combo and you're trying to deal lethal before that happens, it's as simple as that. After sideboarding, they may have some ways to stabilize like siding in Verdict or Elder Gargaroth. Mono Blue Spirits vs Rakdos Midrange. Rakdos has decent threats, removal, and hand disruption. This matchup can break down into a number of play patterns depending on the situation. The most common are land an early Curious Obsession and protect it with counterspells, or race them and focus on countering their creatures. Shacklegeist is important for winning the race, especially for tapping down Kalidas. Unless things line up very well for you, expect to lose creatures to their removal. Curious Obsession is much better on the play than the draw. Remember that they have Thoughtseize to help slip threats or removal past your counterspells, sideboard additional counterspells, and protection. Mono Blue Spirits vs Nykthos Ramp. A fantastic matchup for you. The secret to success is that the only cards you need to counter are Karn and Storm the Festival. It's also worth countering Cavalier, but even if it resolves, you can tap it down with Shacklegeist. They can't block you and have no removal, so it's smooth sailing. Bring in more hard counters like Disdainful Stroke. You can cut Rattle Chain since they have no removal anyway. Mono Blue Spirits vs Greasefang. Priority number 1 is countering Greasefang. If it does resolve, you can use Shacklegeist to tap it or Parhelion down, or bounce either of them with Brazen Borrower. If Parhelion gets to attack you, you lose on the spot though. Bring in Graveyard Hate and more counterspells. You can cut Spell Pierce and Rattle Chains unless they side in a bunch of removal or are playing Eldritch Evolution. Mono Blue Spirits vs Aggro and CoCo. For the white and red aggro decks, your goal is to race them since they can't block your creatures, then use counterspells either to protect valuable creatures of your own, like Supreme Phantom or the Curiously Obsessed, or to counter meaningful threats of theirs. Shacklegeist is great in all circumstances for tapping down big threats or clearing the way of blockers at their end step, untapping and attacking in. Rattle Chains can counter targeted removal and Mausoleum Wanderer some spells. Rattle Chains is worst against blue decks which have counterspells rather than removal. Mausoleum Wanderer is worst against white that has almost no instants or sorceries for it to target. Red has the most removal and instant speed removal at that. They may also have Goblin Chainwhirler. If they're bigger red, be ready to counter big burst damage cards like Embercleave and Torbrand. White tends to go wide and has exile-based removal that you can't interact with like Portable Hole. Be wary of Brave the Elements letting them attack through your board. Although they can't block you, their creatures are bigger than yours and so can outrace you, so it's worthwhile to trade with them when able, especially since it reduces the value of Luminarch Aspirant and Valley's Lieutenant. Blue Mirrors and CoCo decks have instant speed threats and flyers, so matchups will devolve into board stalls more, which is where Shacklegeist is at its most valuable. Games involve a lot of maneuvering around each other's counterspells and CoCos, acting on opposing end steps and baiting spells. For any given matchup, you can board in color hosing cards where appropriate, such as Mystical Dispute. Theft cards like Tempted by the Auric can also be useful. Mono Blue Spirits vs Blue-White Control. Your best play is, as is so often the case, putting Curious Obsession on an early 1-drop and protecting it with counterspells. Although they have some cheap removal, it's easy enough to slip your threats through their counterspells, especially since your creatures are cheap, have flash, and you have a number of ways to counter their counters. You are on a clock to some degree and can't overextend since they have uncounterable Supreme Verdicts. The two big threats to counter are Wandering Emperor and Teferi. Be aware they can cycle Shark Typhoon, which you can't answer, although you may be able to bounce or outgrow the token. Bring in more counterspells, especially Mystical Dispute, and cut Shacklegeist. However, don't completely cut Shacklegeist if they bring in big bombs like Lyra. Mono Blue Spirits vs Izzet Phoenix. This matchup can be rough. They assume the control role and have multiple flyers, including Ledger Shredder and Phoenix, and have 1 mana burn spells. Also, Thing in the Ice flips. Try to counter Shredder and Thing in the Ice and use Shacklegeist to tap down their blockers. You also cannot let Treasure Cruise or Temporal Trespass resolve. Bring in counterspells and Graveyard Hate for Phoenix/Delve. Spectral Sailor is the best cut since you can't afford the tempo loss of activating it. Mono Blue Spirits vs 4-5 color midrange. The good news is they're slow to set up, have few creatures to block with, and their payoffs are expensive 4-5 mana spells that you can somewhat easily counter, especially Bring to Light. However, they have cheap removal and sweepers, including Abrupt Decay, and may have brick wall blockers like Archon of Sun's Grace. Your goal is to race them down before they can get their engine online. If they make it to the mid to late game or slip a big threat or engine piece past your counterspells, kiss the game goodbye since you won't be able to keep up with Fires, Enigmatic Incarnation, or Bring to Light tutoring a sweeper. Bring in all your counterspells. You can cut Shacklegeist since you'd rather fight them on the stack. Blue Spirits vs Rakdos Sac. Generally, you should be able to race them. The main cards to look out for are Mayhem Devil and Claim the Firstborn. Thankfully, you have counterspells and Rattle Chains. Pump effects from Curious Obsession and Supreme Phantom are more important than normal for fighting Mayhem Devil, although they're also vulnerable to Claim. Their various spells are at a disadvantage against your counters, especially Deadly Dispute, which has to sacrifice as part of casting it. Bring in Theft spells for Mayhem Devil, which will immediately swing the game in your favor unless they can kill it. Cut Spectral Sailor. Mono Blue Spirits versus Lotus Field. They have almost no interaction for you and just Arboreal Grazer to block with, which you can just outgrow or attack into with multiple creatures. The only thing you need to do is counter Hidden Strings, Pour Over the Pages, and their payoff spell, e.g. Ultimatum. Bring in all your counterspells. You can cut Rattle Chains and Shacklegeist since they basically don't do anything. You may be on more of a clock in games 2 and 3 since they might have brought in Supreme Verdict or other uncounterable spells like Sphinx of the Final Word. I hope you've enjoyed this guide to the top decks in Pioneer and how to play with and sideboard against them. I'd like to thank my local Magic community and the players I reached out to for their experience and advice regarding the strategies described in this guide, without which this video would not have been made. Special thanks to player DF for sharing their extensive experience on the format. If you disagree with any of the opinions presented in this video, please leave a comment with your reasons. Hey, if you made it this far in the video, I guess you must really like it. Or you just skipped here to see what was here. Anyway, I have a Patreon now. Perhaps you'd consider donating if you enjoy these videos. I also plan on streaming on Twitch so we can actually put all of these guides into practice. Take care.